Aisha Mitchell was used to the bright lights, the roaring crowds, and the pressure of performing in front of millions. As one of the most talented and successful basketball players in the country, she was no stranger to fame or scrutiny. But today she had decided to step out of the limelight for a few hours, to take a walk and clear her head after a grueling charity event. The event, as always, had been a success. Photographers snapping her pictures, reporters asking her about her career and her future, fans clamoring for autographs. The usual. Aisha had smiled, posed and answered politely, but now she craved silence. It was a calm evening in the city, and the sky was painted in soft hues of pink and orange as the sun began its slow descent. Aisha found herself drawn to a quieter part of the city, far from the bustle of downtown, where the streets were lined with galleries, small cafes and boutique shops. This area, known for its artistic and eclectic vibe, seemed perfect for an impromptu stroll. Aisha wore simple yet stylish clothes, sneakers, jeans, and a hoodie, hoping to blend in and not attract attention. She wasn't here as the famous athlete, she just wanted to be Aisha, a woman enjoying her own company. As she walked, her eyes fell upon a unique display in front of a small art gallery. The outdoor exhibition featured a series of live performance artists posing as statues. Each artist was dressed in elaborate costumes, painted in metallic colors that shimmered under the streetlights, and they held perfectly still, creating the illusion of real sculptures. A small crowd had gathered, captivated by the strange beauty of it all. Aisha smiled softly, feeling a rare sense of calm. It was moments like these, quiet, unexpected moments, that allowed her to reconnect with herself, to forget the pressures of being a public figure, even if just for a few minutes. She moved closer to the exhibit, her interest piqued by one particular artist who was dressed in golden armor, holding a sword in a dramatic pose. The level of detail was stunning, from the etched markings on the armor to the intricate expression on the artist's face. Aisha marveled at the dedication and skill it took to stand perfectly still for so long, knowing how much focus and discipline that required. As an athlete, she respected the craft in front of her. The air was warm, the city humming gently in the background. She pulled up the hood of her sweatshirt slightly, more out of habit than a real need to hide. She doubted anyone here would recognize her. In this quiet, artsy corner of the city, she could just be herself, without the weight of her celebrity status. For the first time in weeks, Aisha felt like she could breathe. However, her peace was short-lived. A police cruiser rolled slowly by, its headlights cutting through the evening haze. Aisha didn't pay it much mind at first, but out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the car slowing down as it approached the small crowd gathered near the art gallery. The cruiser stopped, and after a brief pause, the door opened. Out stepped a tall, muscular police officer, his uniform crisp and his boots clinking slightly against the pavement. Officer Derek Quick scanned the area, his gaze sharp and predatory. He was in his late 30s, with a clean-shaven face and a certain hardened look that suggested years of dealing with the worst parts of the city. But what wasn't immediately visible was the simmering resentment and prejudice that fueled his every action. Quick had seen it all, and in his mind he knew who belonged in certain areas and who didn't. His eyes landed on Aisha. From his perspective, something about her didn't fit the scene. A young black woman, casually dressed, standing in front of an art gallery in an upscale part of town. It didn't matter that Aisha was one of the most famous athletes in the world. Officer Quick saw what he wanted to see. In his mind, she was suspicious, and once that seed of doubt was planted, it grew rapidly into full-blown certainty. Without hesitation, Quick began to approach her. His steps were slow, deliberate, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. Aisha, engrossed in the artwork, didn't notice him at first, but as he got closer, the change in the atmosphere became palpable. Conversations in the small crowd died down as people sensed the shift. Some of the onlookers glanced at the approaching officer, their expressions ranging from indifferent to uneasy. Aisha finally looked up, locking eyes with Quick. There was no mistaking his intent. She had seen that look before authority mixed with condescension, a gaze that said, "I'm in charge here, and you need to explain yourself." Her heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. She had been in similar situations before, though it never got any easier. Being a successful black woman, especially one who had achieved so much in a field dominated by men, often came with its own set of challenges, particularly when it came to authority figures like Quick. "Evening," Maram Quick said, his voice low and cold. There was no greeting, no warmth, just the icy professionalism of someone who had already made up his mind. He stopped a few feet away from her, his posture rigid, arms crossed over his chest. "Evening," Aisha replied, keeping her tone calm. She knew better than to escalate the situation. Her father, Senator James Mitchell, had taught her, "Well, always keep your composure, especially when you know you're being unjustly targeted." Still, she couldn't help but feel a spark of irritation at the interruption. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was being scrutinized for simply existing in a space where Officer Quick clearly didn't think she belonged. "You mind telling me what you're doing here?" Quick's eyes flicked to her shoes, then her hoodie, taking in every detail of her appearance as if looking for something incriminating. He didn't care that she wasn't doing anything illegal. His instincts, warped by years of bias, told him she was trouble. "I'm just enjoying the artwork," Aisha said, gesturing slightly toward the exhibit behind her. Her voice remained steady, but inside her irritation was growing. She wasn't in the mood for this. Not tonight. Quick didn't buy it. He took a step closer, his presence looming. "This is a high-end neighborhood. You live around here?" The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Aisha knew exactly what he was implying. Her fingers clenched slightly in her pocket, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm just visiting," she replied, not offering more than necessary. Quick's lips curled into a slight sneer. "Right." Visiting, he took another step forward, and the tension between them crackled like electricity. "You wouldn't happen to have ID on you, would you?" It was a demand, not a question. Aisha hesitated for a split second, weighing her options. She could hand over her ID, but she knew it wouldn't end there. She'd been through this before. Once someone like Quick had you in their sights, it didn't matter who you were. Even if she gave him what he wanted, he'd likely find some other reason to continue harassing her. That's how this worked. But then she thought of her father. He had always warned her that situations like this could spiral out of control if not handled carefully. And as much as it grated on her, she knew she had to be smart. With a slow, deliberate motion, Aisha reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet. She didn't say anything as she handed it to Quick, her eyes never leaving his. Quick snatched the wallet from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers in a way that felt more like a power move than an accident. He opened it and pulled out her ID, scanning it briefly. For a moment, his face registered confusion as he read the name Aisha Mitchell. He frowned, looking back up at her. Quick's eyes scanned the ID again, his brain slowly processing what he was seeing, but his inherent bias prevented him from acknowledging the truth. He squinted at the name, furrowing his brow as if it didn't quite fit into the narrative he had already constructed in his mind. Aisha Mitchell. The name was unmistakable for anyone who had even casually glanced at sports headlines or seen commercials featuring the nation's most celebrated athletes. But Quick, in his self-imposed bubble of cynicism and preconceived notions, dismissed the connection as coincidence. "Are you some kind of athlete or something?" Quick asked, his tone laced with skepticism. He handed her ID back with a flick of his wrist, as though the card itself offended him. Aisha, keeping her irritation in check, nodded curtly. "Yeah, I play basketball." Quick gave a hollow laugh. "Basketball, huh? Right. Let me guess, you think that makes you untouchable, don't you? Flash some credentials, get a free pass. Is that how it works?" The edge in his voice, sharp with sarcasm and barely concealed hostility, cut through the quiet of the street. Aisha could feel her blood pressure rising, but she remained calm on the surface. She'd been down this road before, dealing with people who couldn't or wouldn't believe that a black woman could achieve such success. It was always the same suspicion, doubt, and the assumption that she had somehow cheated the system. "Look, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I'm not looking for trouble. I'm just here to see the art exhibit, like everyone else." "Like everyone else," Quick repeated mockingly, his voice rising slightly. "I don't think so. You don't exactly fit the profile of the usual crowd around here." There it was. The veiled accusation. Aisha had heard variations of this line her entire life, from childhood playgrounds to boardrooms. You don't fit in. You don't belong. The message was always the same, delivered with a smile or, in this case, a sneer. "I didn't realize there was a profile for appreciating art," Aisha shot back, her patience wearing thin. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she knew better than to let it show. Reacting would only give him more ammunition. Quick took another step closer, his posture aggressive, his hand casually resting on his belt, near his holstered gun. The message was clear: "I'm in charge here." "You think this is funny," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can just walk around like you own the place, like the rules don't apply to you? You think I won't take you in if I want to?" Aisha felt the tension in the air thicken, like a coiled spring ready to snap. She could sense that things were escalating, moving beyond the realm of an annoying encounter with a power-hungry cop. Quick wasn't just trying to intimidate her, he was trying to provoke her, to force her into a reaction that would justify whatever he planned to do next. For a moment, Aisha considered her options. She could turn around and walk away, but she knew that wasn't going to work. Quick would find a reason to stop her. She could call her father right now, let him deal with it. But something about the way this officer was acting made her want to handle it herself. She wasn't just Aisha Mitchell, the basketball star tonight. She was a black woman standing up to another form of oppression, one that had followed her in different ways all her life. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Officer, I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here, but I'm not breaking any laws. If you want to arrest me for walking down the street, go ahead. But I think we both know that's not going to end well for you." Quick's face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, you think you're so smart, huh? Think you know how this is going to play out?" Aisha's eyes locked with his, unblinking. "I do." There was a long, tense silence. Quick's jaw clenched, and for a moment it looked like he might back down. But then his expression darkened. Whatever internal struggle he had just gone through was over. He had made his choice. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward him roughly. The suddenness of the move caught Aisha off guard, and she stumbled slightly, regaining her balance just as Quick yanked her closer. "You think you can just mouth off to me?" Quick snarled, his grip tightening around her arm. "You think you can just walk away from this?" The people who had been watching the art exhibit started to take notice. A few murmurs passed through the crowd as they realized that the situation between the officer and Aisha was escalating. Several onlookers pulled out their phones, but Aisha barely registered the movement. Her focus was entirely on Quick, on the way his face had twisted with barely concealed rage, on the way his hand was digging into her arm, sending a dull pain shooting up her shoulder. For the first time, she felt a flicker of fear. "Let go of me," she said, her voice low and steady, though her pulse was racing. But Quick didn't let go. In fact, he tightened his grip, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and stinking of coffee. "I think we're going to take a little walk down to the station," he hissed. "Let's see how tough you are there." Aisha's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let him see her fear. "This is a mistake," she said quietly. Quick smirked. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can walk around like you're untouchable." He began pulling her toward the cruiser, his fingers digging into her arm hard enough to leave bruises. The crowd was starting to murmur more loudly now, but no one stepped forward. They watched, recording, whispering, but no one intervened. Aisha glanced around, wondering if someone would at least call for help, but all she saw were wide eyes and outstretched phones. Her mind raced. She could call for backup herself. She could escalate this situation, turn it into a national headline by the morning. But that wasn't what she wanted. Not here, not now. She didn't want to give Quick the satisfaction of thinking he had gotten under her skin. And then she remembered something her father had once said to her sometimes. You don't need to fight back immediately. Sometimes, the smartest move is to let them hang themselves with their own rope. Aisha exhaled slowly, letting the tension ease out of her muscles. She stopped struggling and let Quick lead her toward the cruiser. He was too focused on asserting his power to notice that she had gone still, too wrapped up in his own anger to realize that he had already lost. "You're making a big mistake," she repeated, louder this time. Her voice carried across the small crowd, and she saw a few people exchange uneasy glances. Quick just grunted and shoved her toward the door of the cruiser, fumbling for his cuffs. But Aisha wasn't focused on Quick anymore. Her eyes flicked to the street corner, where, in the distance, she saw the familiar black SUV turning onto the block. It was moving fast, but not recklessly deliberate, purposeful. She felt a surge of relief, but she didn't show it. Not yet. "You have no idea what's coming," she said softly. Quick paused, his hand halfway to his cuffs. "What did you say?" Aisha met his gaze, her face calm, almost serene. "You'll see." Quick snorted, shaking his head as he turned back to the cruiser. "You're all the same. Think you can get away with anything?" Aisha didn't respond. She didn't need to. The SUV had already pulled up at the curb, and the passenger door was opening. The SUV rolled to a smooth stop at the curb, its dark, tinted windows reflecting the streetlights. It was a sleek, black vehicle, expensive, powerful, and understated. For those who knew what to look for, it was unmistakable a government-issued car, the kind reserved for high-ranking officials or special operatives. But Officer Quick wasn't one of those people. He didn't even glance at it, too absorbed in his own power trip to notice the arrival of something far more dangerous than he could have anticipated.
Aisha stood by the cruiser, her face calm but her heart racing. She knew that within moments, the balance of power would shift dramatically. She had seen her father operate too many times not to understand the precision of his timing, the way he could turn a situation to his advantage with the smallest of moves. But for now, she had to play her part, wait, remain still, and let the scene unfold as it was meant to.
The door of the SUV swung open with a soft click, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man in an immaculate grey suit, Senator James Mitchell. His expression was unreadable, his posture calm, but there was an unmistakable aura of authority that radiated from him. He didn't rush, didn't stride forward with a show of urgency. He simply stepped out of the vehicle, adjusted his jacket, and took in the scene with a measured gaze. Quick was still fumbling with his handcuffs, too focused on Aisha to notice the man approaching from behind. Aisha, for her part, locked eyes with her father for a brief moment, but gave no outward sign that she knew him. She kept her expression neutral, as though this were just another encounter with the police, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to worry about. Senator Mitchell took a slow, deliberate step toward the cruiser, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the sight of his daughter being manhandled by a cop who had no idea what he was getting himself into. He didn't speak yet, didn't intervene. This wasn't the moment. Timing was everything, and Mitchell knew that sometimes letting a situation spiral just a little further was the key to complete control. Quick finally managed to yank the cuffs free from his belt, the metal clinking as he pulled Aisha's arm forward, roughly twisting it behind her back. She winced slightly, but said nothing. This wasn't the time to resist. She needed to keep Quick focused on her, to keep his attention on what he thought was a small victory. He was playing right into their hands. "You're going to regret this," Quick muttered under his breath as he snapped one cuff around her wrist. "Big star, huh? We'll see how big you are when you're sitting in a cell." Aisha didn't respond. She didn't have to. The wheels were already in motion, and there was no stopping what was about to happen. Senator Mitchell stopped a few feet away from the cruiser, his hands in his pockets, watching with cool detachment. Quick still hadn't noticed him. The officer's attention was entirely focused on Aisha, on making sure she knew her place. It was only when Quick reached for the second cuff that he finally caught the movement in the corner of his eye. "Hey," Quick snapped, looking up sharply. "Back off. This is a police matter." Mitchell raised an eyebrow, his expression one of mild curiosity, as though Quick were some sort of unruly child acting out in a grocery store. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched, his silence more unsettling than anything he could have said. "I said, back off," Quick repeated, his voice rising. He straightened up, dropping Aisha's arm for a moment as he took a step toward the man. "You need to get out of here. This is official business." Mitchell's lips twitched, but whether it was amusement or annoyance was impossible to tell. "Official business, he said, his voice calm, measured. "And what exactly are you arresting her for, officer?" Quick hesitated, his brain struggling to process the sudden change in dynamics. He was used to being the one in control, the one with all the power. But this man, there was something different about him. Something that made Quick's instincts scream that he was dealing with more than just an ordinary bystander. "I don't have to explain myself to you," Quick snapped, his confidence faltering just a little. "She's resisting arrest. I'm taking her in." Mitchell's gaze shifted to Aisha for a moment, taking in the way she was standing, the calmness in her eyes, the absence of fear. She was playing her role perfectly. He nodded slightly, a barely perceptible acknowledgement of her restraint. Then he turned his attention back to Quick. "Resisting arrest," Mitchell repeated, his voice soft but with an edge that made Quick bristle. "Interesting. I didn't see her resisting. All I see is a young woman being assaulted by a police officer who seems to be overstepping his authority." Quick's face flushed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about. This is my jurisdiction. You're interfering with." Mitchell cut him off with a raised hand, his expression hardening. "Officer, do you have any idea who I am?" Quick's mouth opened, then closed. The question hit him like a brick wall, stopping him mid-sentence. He hadn't considered that this man might be someone important, someone with power. But now, looking at him, at the way he held himself, the expensive suit, the calm, commanding presence. Quick felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. No, Quick said, but his voice was less certain now. And I don't care, you need to back off. Mitchell took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. His eyes locked onto Quick's, and in that moment, the officer felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just some passerby. This was a man who was used to being in control, someone who had real power. The kind of power that could make a police officer disappear without a trace. "I'm Senator James Mitchell," he said softly, but his words carried the weight of a sledgehammer. "And you're making a very, very big mistake." Quick's face paled. The name hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of his bravado. Senator Mitchell? He had heard that name before everyone had. A high-ranking politician, known for his influence and connections, a man who had fought for social justice and police reform. And now this man was standing in front of him, watching as he tried to arrest his daughter. Senator Quick stammered, his confidence crumbling. "I didn't." Mitchell held up a hand, silencing him. "It doesn't matter what you think you were doing," he said coldly. "What matters is what's happening right now. You are attempting to unlawfully detain my daughter, using excessive force in front of dozens of witnesses." Quick glanced around, suddenly aware of the crowd that had gathered. People were watching, their eyes wide, their phones held up to capture every moment. He felt a wave of panic rise in his chest, but he shoved it down. He was still the cop here. He was still the one in charge. I didn't know she was your daughter," Quick said, his voice wavering. "Does that matter?" Mitchell asked sharply. "Would it have been acceptable if she wasn't?" Quick's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He had no answer for that. He had no defense. Mitchell took another step forward, now standing directly in front of Quick, towering over him. The officer, who had been so full of bravado just moments before, now seemed small and insignificant in comparison. "You've made two very serious mistakes tonight," Officer Mitchell said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "First, you targeted an innocent woman because you assumed, based on nothing but your own bias, that she didn't belong here. Second, you put your hands on my daughter. Both of those mistakes are going to cost you." Quick's hands trembled slightly as he backed up a step, his eyes darting from Mitchell to Aisha and back again. The weight of his actions was crashing down on him, suffocating him. He had overstepped. He had gone too far. And now he was facing the consequences. I didn't mean to," Quick began, but Mitchell cut him off again. "You didn't mean to," what Mitchell asked, his voice rising slightly. "You didn't mean to assault a woman for no reason. You didn't mean to abuse your power because you thought no one would stop you. Or you didn't mean to get caught." Quick's face flushed with shame, but he couldn't find the words to defend himself. He had no defense. Everything Mitchell was saying was true, and he knew it. "You're done here," Mitchell said, his voice final. "You're going to take those cuffs off my daughter, and then you're going to walk away. If you don't, I promise you, your career will be over before the sun rises tomorrow." Quick's hands shook as he fumbled with the cuffs, struggling to unlock them. His fingers slipped on the metal, and Aisha stood silently, watching him, her face calm and composed. She didn't say a word as Quick finally managed to free her wrist, his face pale and drenched with sweat. Mitchell stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Quick could hear him. "You're going to walk away, and you're never going to forget this night." Because if you ever step out of line again, if you ever lay a hand on someone like this again, I will make sure you never work in law enforcement or anywhere else ever again. Do you understand me?" Quick nodded, unable to speak. His mind was reeling, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. He couldn't believe that he had been so blind, so stupid. Mitchell straightened up, turning his attention back to Aisha. "You okay?" Aisha nodded, rubbing her wrist slightly where the cuffs had dug into her skin. "Yeah, I'm fine." Mitchell nodded, satisfied, then turned back to Quick. "Get out of here," he said coldly. "Now." Quick didn't need to be told twice. He turned and hurried back to his cruiser, his hands still shaking as he fumbled with the door. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. He had screwed up badly. And he knew it. As Quick drove away, Mitchell watched him go, his expression unreadable. He didn't feel triumphant or satisfied. He felt tired. Tired of the same fight, the same injustice, over and over again. But tonight, at least, he had won. For now. As Officer Quick's car sped away into the night, Aisha exhaled slowly, finally allowing herself to release the tension that had built up in her muscles. She rolled her shoulders, feeling the stiffness where Quick had roughly yanked her arm. It wasn't the first time she'd been in a situation like this, but it never got any easier. Every time the frustration lingered, the sense of injustice gnawing at her even after the confrontation was over. Senator James Mitchell, her father, remained silent for a moment, watching the cruiser disappear around the corner. His expression was calm, but Aisha knew her father well enough to sense the undercurrent of emotion beneath his composed exterior. This wasn't just about her, this was about every black person who had been mistreated, disrespected, or brutalized by law enforcement, and about the years he had spent fighting to change a system that seemed resistant to any kind of real reform. He turned to her, his gaze softening as he looked her over. "You sure you're okay?" he asked again, his voice quiet. Aisha nodded, her lips pressing together in a thin line. "I'm fine, Dad," she said, though there was a trace of weariness in her voice. She wasn't hurt, at least not physically, but there was a weight on her chest that had settled there the moment Quick had singled her out. It was the familiar feeling of being reduced to nothing more than a stereotype, of being seen as a threat or a problem simply because of the color of her skin. Mitchell stepped closer, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I wish you didn't have to go through this. Not ever, but especially not tonight." Aisha shook her head, forcing a small smile. "It's not your fault, Dad. This is just the world we live in." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "You did what you always do. You stepped in and took control. That's what you do best."
Mitchell's jaw tightened slightly at her words. Yes, he had stepped in. Yes, he had made sure Quick backed down. But the reality of the situation was still suffocating, still ever present. No matter how much power he wielded as a senator, no matter how many speeches he gave or bills he pushed for in Congress, he couldn't shield his daughter or anyone else from this kind of treatment forever.
"It's exhausting," Aisha added after a beat, her voice quiet but steady. "No matter what we do, how much we achieve, it's never enough for some people." Mitchell nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through his own thoughts. He didn't need to say anything. They had had this conversation before, countless times, in countless different ways. But each time it happened again, whether to Aisha, to a friend, or to someone they saw on the news, it stung just as deeply as the first time. "It is," Mitchell finally replied, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "But that's why we keep fighting. We don't stop." Aisha gave a soft, bitter laugh, shaking her head. I know, but sometimes it feels like we're fighting a battle that never ends. Mitchell's eyes darkened slightly, his hand still resting on her shoulder as he squeezed it gently. Maybe, he said, his voice resolute. But it's a battle we're not going to lose, not while I'm still here to fight it. They stood there for a moment, the city humming softly around them, as if the world had somehow moved on from the confrontation that had just taken place. But the truth was, this confrontation wasn't over. It never really was. It was part of something larger, something deeply rooted in the society they lived in. For every victory, for every moment like this where justice seemed to prevail, there were countless others where it didn't. Aisha looked out across the street, her gaze distant, as she watched a few of the bystanders disperse, their phones still in their hands. They had watched the entire incident unfold, but not one of them had stepped forward until it was clear who her father was. Not one of them had offered help when she was alone, facing off against a cop who had made up his mind about her before she had even spoken. They don't care until they know who you are, Aisha said softly, her words more of an observation than an accusation. I could have been anyone, and they wouldn't have cared. But when they saw you step in, everything changed. Mitchell's face tightened slightly at her words. He knew she was right. His status, his position, had given them an advantage tonight that countless others wouldn't have. And that thought, more than anything, left a bitter taste in his mouth. We make them care, Mitchell said quietly, his eyes hardening with determination. We keep pushing until they don't have a choice but to care. Aisha glanced up at him, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. Despite everything, her father had never lost his resolve, never allowed the constant setbacks to break him. He had been fighting this battle long before she was born, and he would keep fighting it long after she was gone. But it didn't make it any easier. Let's get out of here, Mitchell finally said, glancing around as more people started to gather. We don't need to stay here any longer than we already have. Aisha nodded in agreement. She was ready to leave this night behind, even if the memories of it would linger for far longer than she wanted them to. They walked back to the SUV, the tension in the air slowly dissipating as they distanced themselves from the scene. Mitchell opened the door for Aisha, and she slid into the passenger seat, grateful for the chance to finally sit down and breathe. As Mitchell settled into the driver's seat, he paused for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. His mind was racing, calculating his next moves, thinking about how to handle this situation in the aftermath. He knew that Officer Quick wasn't the root of the problem. Quick was just another symptom of a much deeper issue, a system that allowed people like him to thrive, to act without consequence. But tonight had provided Mitchell with something valuable: leverage. We're not letting this go, Mitchell said, his voice steady but firm. Aisha turned to him, surprised by the intensity in his tone. What do you mean? Mitchell's eyes remained fixed on the road ahead as he started the engine. I'm going to make sure Quick faces the consequences of what he did tonight. But more than that, I'm going to use this to push my agenda forward. This isn't just about him, Aisha. It's about the whole system that allows people like him to get away with this kind of behavior. Aisha frowned slightly, unsure of where her father was going with this. You think you can use this to push for more reforms? Mitchell nodded. I know I can. Quick made a mistake tonight. He didn't just pick the wrong person to mess with. He gave me a perfect example of the kind of behavior I've been fighting against for years. I'm going to take this incident and put it right in front of the people who have been ignoring the problem for too long. Aisha leaned back in her seat, processing her father's words. It made sense. She knew how strategic her father could be, how he never missed an opportunity to turn a situation to his advantage, but it also felt personal. This wasn't just another political maneuver for him. This was his daughter, his family, and that gave it a different kind of weight. "I don't want you using this just to score political points," Aisha said after a moment, her voice soft but firm. "This is more than that." Mitchell glanced at her, his expression softening. "I'm not doing this just for politics, Aisha. I'm doing this for you, and for everyone else who has to deal with this kind of thing every day. You know that." Aisha met his gaze, and after a moment she nodded. She did know that. But it didn't make it any easier to accept that her life, her experiences, were being used as part of a larger battle. Mitchell sighed softly, turning his attention back to the road. "I know it's hard. But if we don't use every opportunity we get, we're never going to change anything." Aisha remained silent, her thoughts swirling as they drove through the quiet streets. She understood her father's logic, and part of her even agreed with him. But it didn't change the fact that she was tired of always having to fight, tired of always being on guard, tired of having to be strong in the face of constant adversity. As they pulled onto the highway, the city lights fading into the distance, Aisha allowed herself to close her eyes, just for a moment. The exhaustion was settling in, weighing her down, but she knew that this was far from over. There would be meetings, press conferences, statements to be made. Her father would make sure of that. And while she trusted him, she also knew that the road ahead was long and filled with uncertainty. But for now, just for this moment, she allowed herself to rest. The fight would continue tomorrow. The next morning, Aisha woke up feeling a familiar heaviness in her chest. She had hoped that a good night's rest would ease the weight, but it clung to her, refusing to let go. Lying in her bed, she stared up at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. Officer Quick's voice still echoed in her head, his hands gripping her arm, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into her wrist. It had been yet another reminder of how vulnerable she was, despite her success and influence. After a few minutes, Aisha sighed, pulling herself out of bed. She couldn't afford to let this drag her down. She had obligations today, training sessions, meetings with her team, and an upcoming charity event that she couldn't miss. But most importantly, she needed to check in with her father. She knew him well enough to know that he would be up early, already working on his next move. He never let anything sit for too long, and last night's incident would be no exception. After a quick shower, Aisha dressed casually in athletic wear, tying her long braids back into a low ponytail. As she moved around her apartment, her phone buzzed with incoming notifications. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up, knowing full well what she'd find. There it was, dozens of messages, social media tags and articles already circulating about the confrontation with Officer Quick. Despite the small crowd that had witnessed it in person, word had spread like wildfire, as it always did in this digital age. Some of the messages were supportive, with fans and followers expressing outrage at how she had been treated. Others, predictably, were dismissive, accusing her of overreacting or even fabricating the story for attention. Aisha closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. This was part of the cycle, part of what came with being in the public eye. She had dealt with it before, but it never failed to drain her. The constant scrutiny, the never-ending battle to prove her worth not just as an athlete, but as a person, as a black woman. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her father. She answered quickly, already knowing what the conversation would entail. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice tired but steady. "Aisha, I've been talking to some people this morning," Senator Mitchell said, his tone serious. We need to get ahead of this. The story's already out there, and it's growing. I've got media outlets calling my office asking for a statement. Aisha closed her eyes again, leaning against the kitchen counter. I figured as much, she said quietly. I saw the posts online. We need to make a decision, Mitchell continued. Do you want to go public with this? We can use this incident to highlight exactly what I've been fighting against for years. Or we can try to handle it more quietly, behind the scenes. Aisha hesitated. She had never been one to shy away from difficult conversations, and she knew that speaking out could help bring attention to the issues that affected not just her, but so many others. But at the same time, she was exhausted. She wasn't sure if she had the energy to step into the spotlight yet again, to become the face of another battle. I don't know, Dad, she admitted after a moment. I'm tired. I don't know if I want to go through all of that again. Mitchell's voice softened slightly. I understand, sweetheart. I really do. But this isn't just about you. This is about all the people who don't have the platform you have, who don't have the resources to fight back. Aisha knew he was right. She had been given a platform, one that came with responsibility. But she had also been given more than her fair share of battles to fight, and sometimes it felt like the weight of it all was crushing her. I need to think about it, she said finally, her voice quiet. Take your time, Mitchell replied. But not too much time. The longer we wait, the more control we lose over the narrative. Aisha nodded, even though her father couldn't see her. I'll let you know. They said their goodbyes, and Aisha hung up the phone, her mind still swirling with thoughts. She understood the importance of what her father was saying. She understood the power of using her voice to affect change. But she also understood the toll it took on her. The emotional labor of constantly having to defend herself, of constantly having to explain her humanity to people who refused to see it. She stood there for a few moments, staring down at her phone, wondering what the next step would be. Later that day, Aisha met with her team for a scheduled practice session. It was a welcome distraction, giving her the opportunity to focus on the game she loved. The gym was loud with the sound of bouncing basketballs, the squeak of sneakers on the polished floor, and the shouts of her teammates as they ran drills. It was familiar, comforting in its own way, even if the tension from last night still lingered in the back of her mind. Her coach, Tasha McAdams, noticed her subdued demeanor and pulled her aside after practice. Aisha, you okay? Tasha asked, her sharp eyes scanning Aisha's face for any sign of what was going on beneath the surface. Aisha hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I'm fine. Just dealing with some stuff. Tasha raised an eyebrow. Does this stuff have anything to do with the cop incident I've been hearing about? Aisha sighed, running a hand through her braids. You heard about that already? Of course I did, Tasha said. It's all over social media. You know how fast these things spread. Aisha nodded. She knew Tasha meant well, but she wasn't in the mood for another conversation about it. She had come to practice to get away from all of that, even if just for a few hours. I'm handling it, Aisha said quietly. My dad's on it. Tasha studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, just let me know if you need anything, okay? You don't have to go through this alone. Aisha gave her a small smile. Thanks, coach. As Aisha left the gym that afternoon, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. Her father hadn't called again, but she knew him well enough to know that he was working on something. He never let things like this sit for long. He was probably already making calls, strategizing, planning his next move. But what Aisha didn't expect was what happened next. As she walked through the parking lot, heading toward her car, she noticed a figure standing by her vehicle. It was a man in a dark suit, his posture straight and professional. He was clearly waiting for her, but there was something about him that set her on edge. When she got closer, the man turned to face her, his expression calm but unreadable. "MS. Mitchell," he said, his voice smooth and professional. "I'm here on behalf of Senator James Mitchell. Your father asked me to deliver a message." Aisha's stomach tightened. This wasn't a normal messenger. This man was more than just a simple aide or assistant. There was something about him that screamed power, the kind of power that operated behind closed doors, out of sight. "What message?" Aisha asked, her voice guarded. The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim envelope, handing it to her with a small nod. "Your father would like you to read this carefully. He says it's important that you understand what's at stake." Aisha took the envelope, her heart pounding slightly. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice sharper now. The man didn't answer. He simply nodded again, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd without another word. Aisha stared after him for a moment, then looked down at the envelope in her hand. Her father didn't usually communicate with her like this. He was direct, always willing to have a conversation, always clear about what he was doing. This was different. This felt ... off. She slid into the driver's seat of her car, the envelope resting in her lap as she stared out the windshield. Her mind raced with possibilities. What could be in the letter that her father hadn't been able to tell her over the phone? After a moment, Aisha opened the envelope, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled out the neatly folded letter inside. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, each word carefully written in his precise, formal style. "Aisha, I know this isn't the way we usually communicate, but I need you to understand the gravity of what's happening. The incident with Officer Quick was just the beginning. There are forces at play here that go far beyond what happened last night. I've been in contact with some very powerful people who want to see real change, but who also have their own agendas. The situation with Quick has provided us with an opportunity, but it's also drawn attention from some individuals who are ... less than sympathetic to our cause. I need you to be careful. There are people watching now, people who will use any excuse to discredit us, to turn this against us. You've already seen how quickly things can spiral out of control in the media. It's only going to get worse from here. I've taken steps to protect you, but I need you to trust me. Don't speak to anyone about this unless you've cleared it with me first. We can't afford any missteps. Not now. I love you, and I'm doing everything I can to keep you safe. Dad." Aisha sat there for a long time, staring at the letter in her hands. Her father's words weighed heavily on her, each sentence sinking deeper into her chest. This wasn't just about Officer Quick anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that her father had been preparing for, but hadn't fully explained to her. And now, she was in the middle of it. Aisha folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and anger. She didn't know exactly what her father was involved in, but she knew one thing for certain: whatever it was far from over. The second escalation had begun. Aisha's pulse quickened as the weight of her father's letter settled on her. She had never known him to be anything but direct, and this cryptic message only deepened her sense of unease. He was usually transparent, especially when it came to his political moves or their family's safety. But this time, something was different. There were hidden layers here, and she was only just starting to glimpse them. For the rest of the day, the letter remained at the forefront of her mind, making it nearly impossible to focus on anything else. Practice became a blur of drills, her teammates' voices barely cutting through the fog of her thoughts. Tasha, sensing her distraction, didn't press, but Aisha knew her coach could see that something was wrong. By late afternoon, after receiving no further word from her father, Aisha couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. Her father had warned her to stay quiet, to trust him, but staying in the dark wasn't something she could handle, especially not with the potential threat looming over them. She grabbed her keys, deciding that a face-to-face conversation was the only way to get the clarity she needed. Aisha slid into her car, the same vehicle where the mysterious man had handed her the envelope just hours ago. She glanced at the dashboard, her fingers drumming anxiously on the steering wheel. Something wasn't adding up, and she was determined to figure out what it was. As she pulled out of the parking lot, her phone buzzed on the seat next to her. Aisha's heart leapt, hoping it was her father, finally ready to give her some real answers. But when she glanced at the screen, it wasn't her father's name. It was an unknown number. Hesitant, she picked it up and answered. "Hello." There was a brief pause before a calm, measured voice responded. "Ms. Mitchell, this is Agent Daniels from the Department of Justice. I've been assigned to your father's case." Aisha's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "My father's case? What are you talking about?" "I understand you've been kept out of the loop for your own safety, but recent developments mean it's time for you to know the truth. We've been investigating a larger network of corruption within local law enforcement. And last night's incident with Officer Quick was not an isolated event. It's part of something much bigger." The words hit Aisha like a punch to the gut. "Corruption," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mind raced, trying to connect the dots, but the pieces weren't falling into place. "Yes," Agent Daniels continued. "Officer Quick was under surveillance for several months. We've been tracking his involvement with a group of officers who have been using their positions to target individuals of color for personal gain, extortion, intimidation, and in some cases, far worse. Your father has been quietly working with us to expose them, and last night, Quick made the mistake of targeting you." Aisha's hands shook as she processed the agent's words. "So, what does that mean for me? For my father?" "It means things have escalated," Daniels replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "Your father is a critical part of this operation, but his involvement has made him a target. We have reason to believe that certain individuals within this network are now aware of his efforts and may retaliate. That's why I'm calling. We need to ensure your safety." Aisha's heart raced. She had known her father was fighting a battle on a larger scale, but she hadn't realized just how dangerous it was. Why didn't he tell me any of this? "Your father wanted to protect you," Daniels said. "But now, we're past the point of keeping you in the dark. You're in the middle of this whether you like it or not." Aisha swallowed hard, her mind still reeling from the revelation. "What do I need to do?" "We're arranging protection for you, effective immediately," Daniels said. "Your father has already been briefed, and he'll be moving to a secure location. I'm sending a team to meet you now. Stay where you are until they arrive." Aisha's instinct was to argue, to say she could handle herself, but she knew better. This was bigger than her, bigger than anything she had ever faced before. She wasn't just an athlete caught in a bad situation, she was now a key player in a much larger game, and the stakes were far higher than she had imagined. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll wait." The call ended, leaving Aisha sitting in her car, the silence around her suddenly deafening. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear, but deep down, there was something else, an undercurrent of anger. She had been dragged into this without her knowledge, without her consent, and now her father was in danger because of it. Her hands clenched into fists as she stared out at the city around her, the familiar streets suddenly feeling foreign and hostile. As the minutes ticked by, Aisha forced herself to focus on her breathing, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside her. She needed to stay level-headed, to think clearly. Panicking wouldn't help anyone.
But before the protective team could arrive, a black sedan pulled up in front of her, and Aisha's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the same vehicle as before, but something about it felt off. Her phone buzzed again, and when she glanced at the screen, the unknown number flashed once more.
MS. Mitchell, the voice on the other end, said, the same calm voice as before. I need you to get out of the car now and into the vehicle in front of you. What? Aisha's voice cracked with disbelief. I thought. There's no time to explain. You're being watched, and we need to get you out of there immediately. Trust me, it's for your safety. Her heart pounded as she weighed her options. Everything in her screamed not to trust the situation, but the urgency in Daniel's voice was undeniable. If what he had said was true, if there were people out there looking to retaliate, then she couldn't afford to ignore his warning. With shaking hands, Aisha opened her car door, stepping out into the cool evening air. The black sedan's door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, gesturing for her to get in. She hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The streets around her were quiet, too quiet, and she suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the sedan, her legs heavy with each step. She couldn't shake the feeling that once she got in that car, everything would change, and it wasn't a change she could control. As she slid into the back seat, the door closed behind her with a soft click. The man in the driver's seat didn't turn to face her, but his voice was calm as he spoke. We're going to keep you safe, MS Mitchell. But things are going to get worse before they get better. Aisha's heart sank as the sedan pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic. She wasn't sure if she could trust these people, wasn't sure if she had made the right decision. But one thing was certain, there was no turning back now. The car ride felt like it lasted an eternity. Aisha stared out of the window, her thoughts racing as the city blurred past her. The man driving hadn't spoken since they had pulled away, and she wasn't sure if that was a good or bad sign. Every second felt like a countdown to something she couldn't yet understand. What was her father involved in? And more importantly, how was she supposed to navigate this situation when everything felt like a setup, a trap? Finally, after what seemed like hours, the sedan slowed down and pulled into an underground parking garage. It was dimly lit, with concrete pillars casting long shadows across the floor. The driver parked in a far corner and turned off the engine. Aisha's pulse quickened, and she glanced at him through the rear-view mirror, searching his expression for any sign of reassurance. Stay here, the man instructed, his voice as steady as it had been earlier. Without waiting for her response, he stepped out of the car, leaving her alone in the back seat. Aisha's mind raced. Was this really about protection, or had she just walked into an even deeper trap? She considered bolting, running for the nearest exit, and calling for help, but before she could make a decision, the door on her side opened. Startled, she turned to see her father standing there, his face tight with tension. Dad, she gasped, relief flooding her as she quickly stepped out of the car. James Mitchell wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a firm embrace. I'm sorry, Aisha, he said, his voice rougher than usual. I didn't want it to come to this. Aisha pulled back slightly, searching his face. What's going on? I got a call from some Agent Daniels. He said you were working on something big. And then this car showed up and I know, Mitchell interrupted, running a hand through his graying hair. I had to make sure you were safe before I explained everything. You have to trust me on that. Aisha's frustration flared. Safe? You should have told me what was happening from the beginning. I've been dragged into this without even knowing what's really going on. Her father sighed deeply, his eyes filled with regret. You're right. I should have told you sooner, but this situation, it's complicated and it's dangerous. I wanted to keep you out of it, but after what happened with Quick, there was no more hiding it. Aisha crossed her arms, her anger simmering just below the surface. So tell me now, what's really going on? Mitchell glanced around the garage, his eyes scanning the shadows, as if checking for any unseen threats. Finally, he motioned for her to follow him toward an elevator at the far end of the garage. They stepped inside, and once the doors closed, he turned to her, his expression deadly serious. For the past year, I've been working with federal investigators to uncover a network of corrupt police officers. Mitchell began. It started small, just a few bad cops taking bribes. But as we dug deeper, we found something much worse. This isn't just about dirty money, Aisha. These officers have been using their power to intimidate, extort, and silence people, especially people of color. It's systematic, and it goes higher than I ever imagined. Aisha's heart sank. She had suspected something big, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach churn. And Quick? He's part of this. Her father nodded grimly. Yes, Quick was under investigation for months before last night. We were building a case against him and several others. But when he targeted you, it sped things up. They know we're onto them now, and they're going to do whatever it takes to protect themselves. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors opened to a sleek, modern office space. It was quiet, too quiet, and Aisha's unease grew as she followed her father down a hallway lined with darkened glass. So what happens now? What's the plan? Mitchell stopped in front of a large conference room, his hand resting on the door handle. The plan is to expose them. We have the evidence, but we need to get it out before they can bury it. And that's where you come in. Aisha blinked, taken aback. Me. Mitchell's gaze softened, his voice quieter now. You're a public figure, Aisha. People listen to you. They respect you. We need someone with your platform to bring this story to the world, to make sure it can't be silenced. Aisha's mind raced. She had always used her platform to speak out about issues she cared about, but this was different. This wasn't just a cause, this was a dangerous, powerful group of people who had everything to lose if the truth came out. The stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. I don't know if I can do that, Aisha said, her voice shaky. I mean, I've dealt with the media before, but this is so much bigger than anything I've ever faced. Mitchell placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes full of pride and concern. I know it's a lot to ask, but you've always been strong, Aisha. You've always stood up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. And now we need you more than ever. Aisha swallowed hard, her mind swirling with doubts and fears. She thought about all the times she had faced discrimination, all the times she had been dismissed or underestimated because of her skin color. And now, here was her chance to make a real difference, to stand up not just for herself, but for all the people who had been wronged by the same system that had nearly crushed her. After a long moment, she nodded, her resolve hardening. Okay, she said softly. I'll do it. Mitchell smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Thank you. As they entered the conference room, Aisha's mind was already racing with what she needed to do next. The media would be ruthless, the threats would come, and the system would fight back. But now, armed with the truth, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. Her fight wasn't just on the court anymore. It was in the real world, where the stakes were life and death, and she wasn't going to back down.